Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Workshop Wednesdays, the ASALA Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Workshops. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bahia Muhammad from Howard University, the Social Justice Consortium that has made this possible for us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Greetings and welcome to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALA Workshop Wednesdays, a free 5-part virtual series focused specifically on social justice community engagement. This is a collaborative effort presented by the renowned ASALA and the Howard University Social Justice Consortium. Social justice activist Dr. Lisa Brock has curated these sessions that you will not want to miss. So please make sure that you are registered for all of the sessions are to come and that you invite a friend and pass the word for individuals to join in on this joyous occasion. I am Dr. Bahia Muhammad. I am an associate professor of criminology in the College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Sociology at Howard University. I am so honored to serve as the co-PI on the Mellon Foundation Just Futures grant that funds this phenomenal project. Howard University is a historically Black private research university comprised of 14 schools and colleges. Many of our students pursue more than 120 areas leading to undergraduate, graduate, and professional degrees. Howard University operates with a commitment to excellence and truth and service. And this partnership is accumulation and example of exactly that. This series is brought to you by Howard University's Social Justice Consortium, which is a cross-organizational, cross-institutional, interdisciplinary partnership that is concerned with educating society and developing the critical consciousness people need to analyze injustice in their own communities and to develop innovative and collaborative action-oriented remedies. The Social Justice Consortium in that endeavor has 3 specific pathways to increase community knowledge on this topic, and that includes supporting social justice research, art, and activism, but most significantly, its effort to democratize access to knowledge through courses dedicated specifically to social justice. And these courses will not only deepen community social justice knowledge, but positions the humanities and the humanistic social sciences as a means to solve social problems. Education and empowerment across different sectors and demographics will increase one's critical consciousness, participation in, and efficacy of social justice activism. And that's exactly what's going to take place during this workshop, as well as others. So thank you all for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this workshop and that you will join us for the subsequent sessions to happen next Wednesday, September 29th, also October 6th, as well as October 13th. And also, please be reminded to go to the Howard University Social Justice Consortium website. I'll drop that link in the chat for you so that you all can learn more about the Social Justice Consortium and all of the many HBCUs across the nation who serve as humanities faculty members of the consortium. In addition, the website also will provide you specific information and ways that you can support this movement. In closing, I would like to send greetings to all from our fearless leader and project PI, Dr. Nikki Teller, who was unable to join us on this evening. Again, greetings and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. Before we continue into the presentation, I'd like to introduce the president of ASALA, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Thank you, Dr. Higginbotham.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Welcome to the second of 5 social justice workshops of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. ASALA is hosting Social Justice Workshop Wednesdays as part of the Social Justice Consortium of Howard University, my alma mater. And we are working with Dr. Nikki Taylor, Chair of Howard's History Department and the Principal Investigator of Howard's Social Justice Consortium, which has been made possible by the Just Futures grant of the Mellon Foundation. And we're also very pleased to work with you as co-PI, Dr. Muhammad. Asala was happy to partner with Howard when we were approached by Dr. Taylor because we have for 106 years researched, taught, published, and promoted African American history as a vehicle for understanding of our respect for and our involvement in the practice of social justice. I want to emphasize that word practice because learning isn't theoretical, it is practice. Learning comes through acts of empowerment, meaning through the process of researching, reading, interpreting, discussing, and writing about the past. Asala believes that knowledge gained through this process equips us with the capability, the fortitude, the inspiration, and yes, the courage to demand that the United States live up to the ideals that it professes as a nation, that it professes to its own people and to the world's. Those ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke forcefully during the era of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And King demanded that the United States honor its self-styled identity as leader of the free world in opposition to the Russians, referring to the Equal Justice Amendments of the Constitution. King asserted, "All we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper." So we offer this social justice workshop because our history, the history of African Americans, demands of us that we remember our people's hard-fought struggle for justice over the centuries. In fact, a struggle that continues to this very day. And Asala believes that knowledge of the Black experience should be accessible to everyone. And that's why we foster dialogue between academia and the community. Our association spans the gamut. We have on this call today, high school students, all the way to senior citizens. We reach out widely through our Asala branches to people with many degrees, to those with no degrees. Carter G. Woodson knew that Black liberation requires that we know why we are fighting, what we are fighting for, what we are fighting against, and that we also know the allies who are fighting in support of us and alongside us. The knowledge that leads to Black liberation requires that we certainly affirm the worth and dignity of all our people, regardless of age, of income, of religion, of education, of gender, or sexuality. We are all the Black family. So I'm so pleased to introduce our workshop leader, Dr. Lisa Brock, for the second workshop, Social Justice 102, Understanding the Language of Black Liberation. Dr. Brock is a lifelong activist. She is the founding academic director of the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College. She's now retired. She's a retired professor of transnational Black history, and she's also a graduate of Howard University. However, before I turn the workshop over to you, Dr. Brock, I would like to introduce Michelle Pruchot again, the ASALA Program Coordinator for the Howard Mellon Just Futures Grant, who will provide brief information about the other upcoming workshops and also instructions on how tonight's webinar will proceed. Michelle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Higginbotham. We really enjoyed those words. And so as you heard, this is a part of a 5-part series. Last week, we heard from Dr. Brock with Social Justice 102, and we're really happy that some of you who were on last week, we heard 101, some of you that were on last week will be joining us tonight, and we have an expanded crowd tonight. So thank you for inviting others and coming on. Our last session this month will be next Wednesday. It'll be Dr. Brock's final session where she will discuss the history of policing in communities of color and its implications today. And then our last 2 workshops will be the first 2 Wednesdays in October. On October 6th, we'll be joined by Serena Sebring, who will look at democracy and the title of Street Heat Voting and the Power of Community Mapping. And then our final session will be co-hosted by Alice Kim and Emily Hooper Lansana, and they'll be discussing exploring the impact of mass incarceration. So once again, tonight, we really want you to be a part of the discussion. We see a lot of good conversation in the chat. Shout out to all the ASALA chapters that are on board and the many universities that are present. And everybody else in the group, please let us know about yourself. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa Brock for our presentation tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. I want to specifically thank Howard University Social Justice Consortium and the ASALA team for having me here today to continue our discussion of social justice. I go by she, her, and hers. And so I want to make sure that we understand that pronouns are important these days. Our talk last week was about the language of racial oppression. Today's presentation is about the language and analytics of Black liberation. When in conversation with the organizers of this series, I was asked to develop these first 2 workshops in order to deepen our analysis of common terms and concepts important to understanding social justice today. I realized that very often ideas and ideals are used by organizers and intellectuals in their work, but sometimes misused by those who would deny the right to freedom dream, leaving many not clear on their actual roots and meanings. My goal today then is to share some, just some, of those Black imaginaries and struggles in a historical and contemporary context. There are many more that, of course, we could get to, but we cannot in a small 2-hour session. But hopefully this will stimulate you to do your own study and struggle towards liberation. Today's workshop is dedicated to the Haitian people. We can't think about Black liberation without thinking about the Haitian people. As we all have seen over the last few days, thousands of Haitians have presented themselves to a border station in Texas that is used for intake of those seeking asylum or refugee status. They are not illegal. They are not illegal. No human is illegal. And anyone who can make their way from Haiti, which continues to be devastated by environmental and man-made disasters, to the southern border of Texas is brilliant. I mean, come on. And I would trade any one of them for those who attempted a coup on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. I trade them any day, anytime, anywhere. Thus, it's very interesting that we start our discussion with Haiti and the role that Haiti played in Black liberation. In the late 1700s, just when the US was making its revolution, which guaranteed the citizenship rights of white men of property, Blacks and people of African descent in Haiti, the richest colony in the world, rose up against France, demanding to be free citizens of a new Haiti. I call this moment the Pan African moment, the Pan African moment, because during the nearly 2 decades of bloody struggle, enslaved and oppressed Black people all over the world heard about the revolution in Haiti. In fact, word is that Thomas Jefferson said once that his enslaved people knew about the Haitian Revolution before he did. I call this moment the Pan African moment because during the nearly 2 decades of bloody struggle, enslaved and oppressed Black people all over the world heard about this movement and this revolution. And when Boukman said his prayer, which centered a Black God to launch the revolution, and Toussaint Louverture and the Black men and women of Haiti successfully fought and defeated ultimately Napoleon, the Black world watched, celebrated, and deepened their own fight for freedom. I say this was the Pan African moment because before the Haitian Revolution, most people of African descent in the Americas only dreamed, could only dream of going back to Africa to find freedom and their own humanity, even when that looked nearly impossible. But with the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, Jose Aponte in Cuba, Denmark Vesey in the US, and many more began to believe that freedom might be possible, or that at least a struggle for freedom was worth fighting for in the Americas. Because Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all those in Europe who were enslavers understood the contradictions of the Haitian Revolution and the moment that they were in. Touting freedom for some while enslaving millions of others, this was a big contradiction for them. And they punished Haiti then and continue to do so now. Michel Roth-Trouillot, whose book is on the bottom of my screen, who was a Haitian scholar, argued that the producers of histories of master narratives have worked very hard to silence and make invisible this history, saying it is simply unthinkable to think about a Black liberation and Black revolution. So I know that some here are going to help with some questions. So if at any point folks would like to ask me questions, those that are coordinating that can let me know. I don't know how many of our students from the HBCUs and from other places know the importance and the significance of Haitian Revolution to Black liberation. And so I started with that.
Dr. Brock,
Yes.
that is such an interesting point. Is there more you can say about the connectivity?
Well, one of the things I can say is that my son is named Toussaint after Toussaint Louverture, as well as when the revolution happened, um, there were movements that developed all over the world, really, all over the Americas, especially in Jamaica and in other Caribbean islands. And I mentioned Denmark Vesey. People were inspired and made note of the Haitian Revolution. It was really significant to Black people all over the world and gave them hope that freedom actually might be possible in these Americas that was enslaving them. And we have evidence that people were writing about it and people were being moved about it, people were talking about it. And so that's why I call it the Pan-African moment. And it has continued to resonate as really in some ways the beginning of Black liberation struggles in the Americas. So I'll go on with my next slide and we can continue to discuss if we like. Um, So as I said, the Haitian Revolution has been silenced. And the question is, why has it been silenced? I mean, when the news media today talks about all the Haitians at the border, they never mention the heroic history of Haiti and the importance of history to Black people. That whole history has been erased and silenced in sort of the normalized media and that we hear today. And it's done that because Haiti was determined to stop the exploitation of Black people. As I said above, Haiti was known as the pearl and the riches of the Antilles because it brought so much wealth to French capitalists and all those that they traded with. So, people ask, how did they get so rich? And so I have this slide here because this is so important in the analytic of Black liberation, that we understand how we got poor and how they got rich. They got rich through the theft of Black labor, and that is the Black labor who worked and died young on the land that was stolen, not ceded, from indigenous peoples. This is important. Many people today hear the word exploitation and don't know what it means. What it means is making money off of someone else's work, land, and resources. During the period of enslavement, this was super exploitation, in that the enslaved were not paid anything for hundreds of years, thus allowing those who exploited them to gain the wealth off their backs. Today we have prison labor, which is nearly paid nothing, in a very similar way of super exploitation. And we also have what is called wage theft. This is people being paid way below what they should be paid for their labor, thus allowing the owners of, say, McDonald's and or Amazon to become billionaires. I'm introducing a relatively new term here called racial capitalism. I'm not sure if most of our audience are familiar with this. We're familiar with racial oppression, and we're familiar maybe with exploitation, but we're not we're familiar with capitalism, but we're not necessarily familiar with when we put the two words together. This was first theorized by Dr. Cedric Robinson, who's in the middle here, in the late 1980s, who illustrated that racism and capitalism developed together and are still tethered to each other through super exploitation of Black people and other peoples of color, and to some extent, poor white people as well, exploitation of their labor, land, and resources. In fact, in my own research, I discovered that many of the, when the stock markets emerged in Europe in the 15 and 1600s, some of the very first companies that were traded on these new stock markets, which people could invest in to get profit, were in fact slave trading companies or companies related to slave trading and the slave industry. And so it is really impossible to think about the evolution of capitalism without thinking about the evolution of racism. I have a slide here on the right of Claudia Jones, a West Indian socialist who first lived in the United States. She was from the West Indies. Her family moved to the United States. She first lived in the US, but was deported because of her views. She ended up living in Britain, and she articulated this position of the link between racism, and capitalism throughout the rest of her life.
Dr. Brock,
Yep.
we have a hand raised from one of the people who was here last week, A.M. Signer. I didn't know if she had anything to say. Let me see if I can find her really quick at the top. There she goes.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. I'm sorry, my hand, the raising and the lowering of this hand keeps popping up on me. I really did not have a question, but I just wanted to maybe ask one, well, just a point. Could you mention just briefly about Haiti and the United States in regards to the doubling of the size of the US because of the Haitian Revolution, that Americans really owe a debt to Haiti for our size. Because of the revolution, you know, Napoleon sold Louisiana for a song, $15 million, the best land deal in the history of the world. So could you mention something along those lines?
Well, you said that, so I don't have to say it. But I mean, the debt, the Haitian Revolution led to a lot of changes. It also led to the increasing and deepening notion of manifest destiny through the way in which they wanted to conquer the western part of the United States, but also the ways in which they wanted to neo-colonialize, if not officially colonize, the Caribbean and Latin America so that another Haitian Revolution would not happen. The US occupied Haiti, it blockaded Haiti. France forced, before it would trade with Haiti, it forced Haiti to pay back for the loss of property, which was us, it's human property. And so when you say the United States owes a debt to Haiti, I'm not sure if I would use that word. What I would say is that we as Black people owe a debt for their bravery and their determination to be free. And the US benefited from what happened to Haiti afterwards, which was another wave of a different kind of repression, occupation, and exploitation. But their bravery in many ways is what set up Black liberation. So thank you for that.
Dr. Brock, we have another question. It says, Dr. Brock, can you elaborate on the existing of financial relationship between Haiti and France? Does Haiti currently have any financial obligations to France because our brothers and sisters liberated themselves in 1904?
They paid about $40 million to France over the years. And I think that debt has been paid by now, which is a shame, But for them to be able to participate in the world, they had to pay that debt. Right now, I don't think that they owe France anything, but they did pay as a poor nation. So France owes Haiti that money back. It definitely owes Haiti that money back. And that is a part of the discussion of reparations at the UN and in different sectors of the world.
We have one question in the Q&A section before we move on, Dr. Brock. Gigi Davis asks, can racism exist outside of capitalism in the United States?
Interesting question, very interesting question, because I'm a student of the Cuban Revolution as well, which means that I've looked at a multiracial socialist society, and I think it can. I think it can. I think it might exist in a different way, but I think we have to be vigilant in understanding that if we fight against capitalism, we have to also fight against the other intersecting systems of oppression at the exact same time. Because if we don't do that, we have evidence that once something gets, for instance, if we just fought against capitalism and had the class struggle, and we didn't address the discourse and the narratives of racism, we might end up with a situation where we might solve certain things like the Cuban Revolution did with certain levels of poverty and housing and structural racism, which to us looks like a great thing, but you still might have narratives and discourses and lack of teaching of Black history. If that's not actually discussed, it can actually also not happen. So I think everything has to be on the table at the same time. I think it's hard to get rid of one without fighting the other. I think we have to do it all at the same time. So that when in fact, let's say we had a situation where we didn't have capitalism, we would also have a situation where we didn't have racism, but we have to fight for both of them at the same time. We can't just fight for one, fight against one. So should I continue?
You can go ahead and continue.
Okay, so my next slide is another term, and I'm trying to introduce some of these concepts and terms of Black power and Black consciousness. Of course, we've heard of Black pride, we've heard of Black power, we've heard of Black consciousness. And I just really wanted to, as we're dealing, last week we dealt with the language of racial oppression. This week we're dealing with the language of Black liberation. Clearly, these are terms that are part of the language of Black liberation. And Black pride, Black power, Black consciousness developed because they had to. I mean, they just had to, you know. For those who were enslaved in the Americas and then colonized in Africa, to not develop some kind of self-affirming actualization in the face of social death would have been a kind of second death. One's life might be enslaved, but one's mind could actually fight and struggle to be free. W.B. Du Bois, who's the first person on the slide, developed the concept of a condition of oppression, which other oppressed groups have also used now. In fact, it's interesting. It's called double consciousness. I had some students who had studied feminism, and I was really surprised that they understood double consciousness with women's struggle, but didn't know that it came from W.B. Du Bois, which is a problem, in my opinion. But Du Bois talked about Blacks in the Americas having this double consciousness in which we struggle to see ourselves as whole, beautiful beings, you know, in our whole humanity, in the face of white supremacy, racism, and exploitation, painting us as unworthy of living into our full humanity. And so Du Bois talked about this struggle that we often have. And I know last week we talked about internalized racial oppression when we lean on one side where we think we're unworthy, where we put down our own people, where we become anti-Black. All of that comes from white supremacy. But what Black power and Black consciousness did and does is it creates the conditions where we say we are Black and we are proud in our bodies and our histories and in our humanity. And so Du Bois talked about the struggle, but Black power and Black consciousness talked about the winning of this self-affirmation and the struggle for the winning of this self-actualization. The person in the middle is Marcus Garvey, who in the 20th century unabashedly challenged anti-Blackness and held massive parades in Harlem and other parts of the world and the country to celebrate Blackness. Frantz Fanon, Steve Biko was struggling against apartheid and developed the highly politicized notion of Black consciousness, that accepting your Blackness is a political act. And it really mobilized the Soweto youth and those of South Africa in the 70s and then the 80s, and where Mandela and others had begun the struggle. In many ways, Biko, along with the ANC of South Africa and that kind of consciousness, began work to turn apartheid around and to ultimately defeat it. And then the final picture I have is Frantz Fanon, who talked a lot about fighting against the colonized mind. He was mainly looking at colonial Africa and how this double consciousness also happened there. And he called internalized oppression the colonized mind. And he talked about the fact that we needed to fight against that in order to realize our own humanity. And also, we had to believe in that to actually fight, to actually fight. So I'm going to change the slide here. So coming out of, and I should tell you that in many ways, all of the things that I've been talking about, they don't just pop up in history. You know, I mean, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, all the people we do not know in the 17 and 1800s were striking these paths long before they were coined in terminology and became known by others. So it's not like Black consciousness or Black pride just popped up in the 20th century or the turn of the 20th century. These are things that were acted on before. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way actual things kind of become theorized in a minute. So coming out of all of this is what is now called the Black radical tradition. The Black radical tradition is a collection of cultural, intellectual, action-oriented work aimed at disrupting social, political, economic, and cultural norms that originate in anti-colonial and anti-slavery efforts. This is not simply about inclusion, people. This is not simply about Black people being included in a white society, but making new societies in which we are not marginal, in which we are not oppressed. This tradition is not only resistance against structures rooted in slavery, imperialism, and capitalism, but the maintenance of an ontology, that is our cultural traditions, our beliefs, our values, making sure that our Black joy, our dances, are the way we pray, the way we talk, the way we do everything is also a part of who we are and should be um, realized and affirmed and not denied as we try to fit into a society that was really not made for us. So we have to make a new society in which we are a central part of. So from ship revolts to maroon communities, from abolition to civil rights, from Black power to Black Lives Matter, the major goal has been to be strategic and to engage in strategic action to maintain and advance the dignity and humanity of Black people. I put 3 people here who have been working in this tradition. Dr. Barbara Ransby is both a well-known scholar and activist. She writes about Black social movements and she's engaged in Black social movements. Same thing with Dr. Robin Kelly. And Dara Cooper has been very involved in food justice and land rights for Black people. And as the climate crisis gets worse and worse, we are going to need to really rely on some of our old knowledges of how to grow food, how to grow good food, and given the social determinants of health, how to create habits and other kinds of foods that are available to our people in our communities all over this country. So I'll take any questions if I'll stop there for a second.
Dr. Brock, we have a question.
Okay.
Dr. Brock, I actually have a question. This is Nick. Due to the subject at hand, I was wondering, is Black capitalism inherently anti-Black in itself? The striving for Black wealth and assimilating into the power structure of our country in the capitalist society that oppresses so many of our people. Is that anti-Black in itself, and do we need to reevaluate things?
Yeah. Nick, that's a brilliant question. That's a brilliant question. In my humble opinion, I think Black capitalism, I think capitalism as a whole, at least, especially in in all phases, as I've said before, is based on exploitation of somebody or some resources or some land somewhere, because it's based on profit. It's based on someone creating a way in which they can make a lot of money outside of their own labor. And so it's based on profit, and profit is based on exploitation. Now, that doesn't mean that certain areas of the economy can't engage in profit development and share the resources with the people that made it. So for instance, 10 people make 100 cars, and those all the profits from the selling of those 100 cars go back to those 10 people equally. So it's not necessarily bad if it's used in a certain kind of way. But to promote Black capitalism in the ways in which it's been organized in this country today is highly, highly problematic in my estimation, partly because if you have a system that's based on the exploitation of the many, which it is, and it means you're going to have a pyramid society. So you might end up with a few Black people like Jeff Bezos, which I doubt because of racism. But let's say you had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 100 or 500 people who were very rich in terms of promoting Black capitalism. They have to, in order to get there, they have to exploit somebody. And I'm not for exploitation. If in fact, I'm not against small businesses or entrepreneurial structures that benefit the communities and benefit the societies, but I don't think Black capitalism is the way to go. First, it's based on exploitation, and two, it is not, in the current system we live in, it is definitely not going to benefit the majority of Black people.
As an extension of that, we also have another question from Carol Bowie, who says, please speak to the marginalization that might occur within these new Black societies, that is, Blacks marginalizing one another.
When I say what we want, if the Black radical tradition brings about new societies, how to make sure we don't have marginalization within those societies?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That's an excellent question as well, because we've seen it before, and I'm going to talk, my next slide actually is about Black feminism and intersectionality, because as I said before, we have got to fight all the isms at the same time and work to create humanistic relationships among each other as we struggle for these societies. So I know one of the things that Charlene Carruthers' book, Unapologetic, talked about, which I was really moved by, and that was literally in the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a sexual predator. And this can happen. This happened in the civil rights movement. This happens in all movements where you have sexism, which is also another ism, which we're going to get to, another way in which oppression intersects with race and intersects with other kinds of systems. And so, but what they decided to do is to create communities of care, and also to engage in restorative justice along the way. So they sat down with this young man, and he agreed to engage in a restorative justice project with the woman that he sexually assaulted. And within that community, they were able to come up with a solution that did not involve the prison system or the police, which of course, once, we don't want to send our people to jail. And so in that instance, I mean, we have these movements now of self-care and restorative justice. And I think that's the way we get to the kind of societies that we're looking for. I actually don't truly believe in utopias. I think we can definitely get closer to justice, but we have to work hard all along the way. And even when we're there, to make sure that justice is at the center for everybody, is at the center of what we do. And also, when we think about queer identity and sexuality within the Black community, that has historically been marginalized, and really brilliant and wonderful people in our community have been marginalized, and some people we don't even know about in our history because we haven't looked for their presence in our history. I was just thinking of Pauli Murray. You all should go look her up. You should Google her right now. But I think, and with the Black Lives Matter movement, they were very clear that they were gonna, well, it emerged with 3 queer Black women, the Black Lives Matter movement, and they were not gonna be put down. They were not gonna be told they're not a part of the Black community. In fact, they were leading us in the Black community. And I think that we have learned so much from the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives, and the younger generation today that is centering marginal Black folks within our community and having them lead us. So, I hate to say it, I mean, the civil rights movement was great, but Bayard Rustin, who was gay, was not allowed to speak on the March on Washington. We know about issues of sexism within that movement. And we've learned from that. I'm not to say that it wasn't a great movement, but we need to learn from these things, and we need to make sure that justice happens and that all Black lives matter to us. And so I guess I would say is that we have to make sure that we center the voices of the most oppressed and most marginal in our community so we can get there. We can get there. We can't wait. We can't wait. We can't say, oh, let's let the Black men lead us and then we'll bring that other issue up later. Or let's let Black capitalists get in place and then we'll bring that in later. It doesn't work. History has shown us it doesn't work. We have to all be in this together. And when people make errors or people make mistakes or people really do things that are really that harm others, they have to be challenged, and we have to figure out ways within a Black liberatory structure that deals with that while we're building a new society. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. I know you said you had another slide that kind of related to one of our other questions. So I think we should move to the next slide, and then we have a couple more questions for you.
Okay. Okay. And you know, people can make comments. I mean, I'm not an expert on everything. I love engagement and I love new ideas as well. So anyone who wants to share some of what they know, I appreciate. One of the things in terms of Black liberation concepts and terms, I think we have to talk about Black feminism and intersectionality. And one of the things about this that I think is really important, and I kind of linked it to something I said before, is like all good theory and concepts, these are terms that expand language into something that already existed and people have already been conscious of, but didn't have the language or the concept for, and especially for Black women. And yet, you know, it's interesting, this term feminism, because for many of us, Black women, I was talking to a friend just a couple of days ago, when the word feminism emerged in the 60s and 70s and became popular, we had trouble identifying as feminists, as Black people, as Black women. Because like Angela Davis said, you know, in the 60s and 70s, she would go to the women's liberation meeting and it was led by all white women. And she couldn't bring up race. And when she went to the Black civil rights or Black power meeting, it was led by all Black men. And she couldn't bring up gender or sexuality. And so the issue is, well, where do I fit in? I exist. I exist. And so that was the experience for many of us. Because after all, Black women have always dealt with sexual harassment, patriarchy, domestic violence, and toxic masculinity, both from our oppressor and within our own communities. It's so interesting. I have an image here of Sojourner Truth. I know it's some controversy about whether or not she actually said it the way she said it in terms of "Ain't I a Woman" at the a women's suffragette meeting. But what she was saying is, I'm not just an abolitionist that's Black, I'm also a woman and a mother. I done born 13 children, she said. So Sojourner Truth was a Black feminist, even though the term was not used at that time. She was an abolitionist and a fighter for women's rights. So there have always been Black feminists, but the term really took hold, you know, in the 70s with women in California like Black Linda Burnham and Audre Lorde and Beverly Smith with the Combahee River Collective in Boston, who were a group of Black lesbians who were taking it even to sexuality. So it's not just being Black, it's not just being a woman. What if we're lesbian? What if a person is gay? Are they not still Black? Do they not still get stopped by the police? Do they not still have an experience within a Black family and a Black church and a Black life and a Black school as a Black person? And so I think Black feminism and intersectionality go together. And what the term intersectionality has done is to really expand, I think, Black feminism into an understanding of our intersectional identities. And I think this is so important, especially for the young people in the audience, maybe not the young people. It's really opened up things for me. So intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. When the woman in the middle there is Kimberly Crenshaw, when she's an attorney, and she coined the term of intersectionality, because when she would take Black women to court, um, the courts just saw them as Black and not mothers or women who were dealing with issues like white women, such as domestic violence or having their children taken away or things like that. And so she was like, these aren't just Black people, these are women too. And she began to argue about the intersectional discrimination of Black women. And since that, others have kind of troubled that original thing by actually saying, well, we can use this framework to think about a lot of different things, not just discrimination, but also privilege. So I'd like to point to this graph I have on the left here, which I think really, it's a very simple graph, but it allows you to see in some ways what I'm talking about. And so let's say you're Black, so that's your race. Let's say you're trans, that's your sexuality. And let's say you're poor, that's your class. Those are three intersecting identities and social identities that are going to create massive amounts of oppression and discrimination for you. And so there are three intersecting identities that place you in many ways at the brunt of oppression. Let me say something else though. Let's say your race is white, and let's say your gender is a woman, and let's say your class is wealthy. You might have some gender discrimination in your life, but you do not have race and class discrimination. You might be rich and still suffer domestic violence. So you don't have the triple effect of oppression, but you do have one aspect of it. And so I can't go into all of this, but you should take a screenshot of this slide. And because I think it's a very useful tool. And like with language, for people whose first language is not English, that also is a level of oppression in our country. And so thinking about intersectionality as a way in which social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege, I think helps us understand many things. Like many people were like, white women voted for Trump, at 54%. Well, they leaned into their race of whiteness and not into their gender, because Trump was a racist. And not Trump was a rapist. So they said, oh, we don't care about that because he's for us as white people. So this analysis, I think, helps us see many different things. I will also say that even though it was slightly different, more Black men voted for Trump than Black women. Again, leaning into privilege and oppression in certain kinds of ways. So I'll take another question if there is one.
Dr. Brock, we have a question, and it starts off with, first, I feel honored to be able to learn more about Black history as an older white woman, 79. I don't quite understand not wanting to be included in white society. I know you want to maintain your own society as worthy and dignified. I want that too, but inclusion feels like the positive thing for me. Where am I wrong in that feeling? Does that also mean that I cannot be included in the Black society?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. And you'll be welcome in any society that we create. I'm not trying to create separate societies. I'm trying to create one society that does not have exploitation and racism. And the issue of what often happens, I mean, believe it or not, what is her name?
I believe Rosie.
Okay, Rosie. I taught for many years in predominantly white institutions, and I attended white institutions, and many people who work in the workplace and who teach in academic institutions that are predominantly white, work in institutions, work in companies that are predominantly white, that are Black, will tell you that just being at the table does not mean that they don't experience racism. So just being included or just diversifying when the power dynamics remain the same is not enough. So what we're talking about is creating a society where we don't have those power dynamics. where we didn't have to wait for a million years to have a Black president, where we're still waiting a million years to have a woman president. And I just use that as an example because when Barack Obama became president, he became president of a white supremacist society. So his inclusion moved the needle a little bit, but it didn't change the structure of society. I don't know about you, but in Chicago, where I live, the homeless population is growing, and it's largely Black, disproportionately Black and white. So we're not talking about a separate Black society. We're talking about a society where power and privilege, as it has been known, is gone. It's gone. So white people have to compete with Black people on the same leveling playing field on every level. That that Black people don't have to suffer racist jokes and don't have to be afraid to speak their mind and can demand equal pay for equal work. All these kinds of things are the kind of society I'm talking about. We're not trying to create a separate society, but a society in which we don't have racism and we don't have the power dynamics that we have today. And so that's what I'm talking about, Rosie. I mean, what would America look like if it was actually led by people of color and that we were multilingual? You would be welcome. It would be different, but you would be welcome. And you'd probably be freer than you are today because everybody then will be freer. So that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about separation. We're talking about complete transformation of the society in which we live in.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We also have another question from our question and answer chat.
Yeah, we've got a comment as well as a couple questions. When we spoke about Black capitalism earlier, Laura Ellen McKinney commented, there's a new television show, I believe it's on Fox actually, Our Kind of People, which clearly illustrates that when Black capitalism is structured on the American system, it exploits other Black people. It creates a Black elite, which requires that others of us are considered to be of low status. So you're correct that dismantling capitalism means dismantling racism and classism.
Yeah. Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Because what's happened is, I think somebody, Dr. Taylor asked me last week, could Black people be racist? And I mentioned to her that for many years, we used to say no, because Black people couldn't be racist against white people because we didn't have power, right? If you don't have power, we don't have power to determine, we as a group, Black people, power to determine where people live, how much money people make, whether or not people have health care. As a Black community or Black communities, we don't have the power in structures and systems as they exist today to be able to do that. So I used to say that racism, we couldn't be racist against white people because we didn't have that. And we didn't really have the power except through struggle to impact the lives of Black people. But it's so interesting in this, what people are calling late capitalism. We have a situation where you do have the ability for Black people, because of their, some, very few, Black people, because of their system, because of their positionality, to be actually racist against other Black people. I think I used the term last time, it was called anti-Blackness. And the reason that happens is because capitalism and racism are so connected and the systems are so set up that if you're going to exploit somebody in America, you're going to exploit the people at the lowest in society. And that's Black and Indigenous and people of color. They're the ones that are exploitable in bulk. That's not to say that you don't have poor white people that are exploited as well. But in terms of disproportionate numbers of who the society says it's okay to exploit at a high level, because of enslavement, because of genocide, because of colonialism, it is people of color, and especially Black people and Indigenous people and Puerto Rican people and trans people who happen to be Black and poor. And so I really think that we can have Black capitalists, but it's probably going to be us that are exploited. And when we think about the creation of elites, all we have to do is look at some systems in countries that are predominantly Black, in Africa, where you have Black elites who make a lot of money on oil and other things in terms of negotiating deals with the West and not using those resources in Africa, for instance, for the people themselves. So having Black elites is not a goal of people who are interested in Black liberation.
One of our undergraduate students, Leah Anderson, asked, can you please speak to the lack of leadership representation within the movement today? How do we choose leaders who can push our agendas forward?
This is a student. Did she have a name?
Leah Anderson.
Hey, Leah. I wish I could see you. One of the downfalls of this webinar stuff is I can't see faces. I was complaining about that to the organizers, but it's nothing we can do. Well, Leah, the leader is you, baby. The leader is you. The leader is you. You have to decide that you are going to be a leader in the movements that you create. When I looked at those young people coming out after George Floyd or Mike Brown or Trayvon, I mean, it just, my heart was so full. These are young people deciding, they didn't have to go to school to decide to become a leader. They learn in the movement, you know, they learn, they decide something is wrong and they begin to get busy. Now, there are certain things and trainings like this that can help you become more developed. And I would suggest, you know, you go to workshops and trainings that help you develop as a leader. But I don't think it's about choosing our leaders. I think it's about all of us becoming our leaders. And I think that's the way we have to think. I'm really disappointed by the some of the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus right now. They used to be more radical. Now they're challenging the more radical elements like the squad, who are actually arguing for things like, you know, better healthcare and all kinds of things. And they're putting up more moderate Black people against the more folks who are talking about Black liberation and other people's liberation in this country. And so I think we have to continue to, those are the kind of leaders I look to, these young folks who are getting busy and deciding to take a stand on issues that are important. Because one of the things I think that's important here too, as a person who studies history, for instance, Cedric Robinson's term, racial capitalism, was written about in 1985, but people weren't ready to hear it, but they're ready to hear it now because there was movement in between. You know, Sojourner Truth was acting as a Black feminist, but the terminology, the development wasn't there, but is here now. So we don't wait on somebody to tell us what to do. We decide it's important to do, and we study. I always use the term study and struggle, study and struggle. We have to study and begin to develop new frameworks, new structures in order to create our own liberation. So it's not about choosing leaders, it's about being leaders. Wherever you are, if you're a student, organize, you know, organize. So that would be my answer to that one.
We are able to bring Leah in if she would like to speak and respond to anything Dr. Brock has said. Also, I want to note that there are a lot of people hyping up Leah's leadership ability in the chat. So I think you are going to be a great leader for the future.
I thank you very much. Thank you for your response to my question. Thank you for hosting this event. I'm very glad to be here. I've already learned a lot, and I definitely received your answer. I have been feeling that way, but I just wanted to know because I did just read, I think it was a Martin Luther King reading, and I had to do a comparison about the movement from back then and today. So I was just wondering if there was a solution, but thank you.
Thank you. Well, you know, I'd mentioned Barbara Ransby. You know, she wrote a book on Ella Baker. who was, until the book really, was an unsung hero of the movement, like Baird Rustin. Baird Rustin was a queer Black man who organized the 1963 March on Washington and then couldn't speak because he was queer. And Ella Baker always had this notion that the movement is from the pew, not from the podium. Not from the preacher is not the leader, the people are the leader. And that's where the movement is. Mandela had a very similar notion that, he felt like he was behind the people, pushing, steering, leading, not in front of the people, trying to drag them in one direction or another. I think movements find leaders. And I think leaders play different roles. I mean, Dr. King and Malcolm X were wonderful articulators of the moment. And they emerged as leaders and people trusted them as leaders. So they didn't just decide one day, I'm going to be a leader. They emerged from the movement. But I think we always have to think about, I know the Black Youth Project used to say that we are leaderful, not leaderless. Because one of the things that often happens is, and I saw this actually with student organizing, is I remember the president of the college I was at, after the students were demanding an intercultural center and I was running the social justice center. And she said, well, who is the leader? And I said, I have to ask them. I have to ask them. And they chose not to send one person to meet the leadership. They all wanted to meet with the leadership. And so I think we need to begin to think more and more like that. And everyone has certain skills. So it's not like, everyone is putting in what they can. So even if you're a quiet person, you can still be a leader. It's not just the person that speaks that's necessarily a leader. It's the person who organizes, who's there, who has some humility, who studies, who's willing to listen, and who has some courage, So there's a lot of things that go into leadership development. But I think it comes from us within. So good luck. I'm gonna be looking for you.
We had a question that goes back to your feminist
Okay.
presentation, and then we can move to the next one.
Okay.
It says, from Margaret Bristow, I do not see why so many Black women and women in general allowed the ubiquitous use of you guys for both women and men. I have never heard anyone come in my room and say to a bunch of guys, girls, your pizza is ready. How do you feel about that, the ubiquitous use of you guys? We fought hard to be recognized as Black women, to be subjected to now you guys.
Oh, these are really astute questions. I really, really appreciate that. I don't like it. And one of the things I've learned about language, and I've had to learn a lot as an older activist from younger activists around pronouns, and also this notion of how leadership is developed. And so I don't like it, and I think we should not use it. And one of the ways I think that we change our language is just through practice and through stopping it. So if somebody comes into a room full of women and says, hey, you guys, you can say, excuse me, hey, please don't say that, because we're not guys, we're women. We're young women, we're old women, we're feminists, we're whatever identifier you want, but you're clearly not guys. And so I think the way you do that is to interrupt it, because I have been interrupted on. I remember years ago using terms like, we need to man the table. And I don't say that anymore. We staff a table at an event. We don't man a table. So we all have to learn, and it comes from practice. So you have to practice it. And one of the things when you interrupt it, it causes the other people to think. And they probably also don't like it either, but it's just easy and it's normal and it just happens because it happens in language. But also I'll say the reason you don't say, hey girls, when it's a bunch of men is because when men say that, it's usually used in a derogatory, oppressive way. It's a demeaning thing to call a man a girl. but not a demeaning thing to call a girl a guy because of the history of these oppressions I've been talking about, history of sexism. And I've always been offended by that when men will say to another man, "Oh, you're a you know what," or "Oh, you're a this," or "Oh, you're that," because and they use gendered language or gendered women's parts of the body to demean a man, as if somehow having women um, physical capabilities and physical attributes is a negative. But it's based all on this. It's all wrapped up on systems of oppression, such as sexism. So challenge it every time you see it. I will tell you a little side story. When I was coming up in the 60s and 70s, I remember the term good hair, excuse me, was used all the time. If someone had long flowing hair in the Black community, oh, they had good hair. And we know what that meant. And so I made it a campaign of my young life that I was going to challenge that every time I heard it. And I did. I could be at a party. I mean, I'm in high school and junior high school. I could be at a party and someone would say, "Oh, where's that girl with the good hair?" And I'd say, "I don't know anybody with good hair. I just don't know anybody." I would interrupt, even though I know who they were talking about, I would interrupt it. And my friends tell me today that helped them grow and change because they know it's problematic. Very often they know it's problematic. They just don't have other languages and they don't have people interrupting them enough to encourage them and push them to change.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. I think we should go through a couple more slides.
Okay, I got a couple more. So, critical race theory, oh boy, is all the rage today. Somehow, right wing Fox TV and that cohort got wind of the notion of critical race theory, which is about 40 years old. And it's so interesting. They have made it this huge boogeyman. And really, critical race theory, the reason it's a boogeyman to the right is because it challenges the master narrative of silencing Black history and Black voices and Black experiences in the United States. It started out by lawyers, the term, the whole, again, Leon Higginbotham started writing about the ways in which the legal system from way back discriminated and oppressed people of color. And then Derek Bell, a Harvard law professor in the 1980s, began to coin the term when he talked about the way the prison industrial complex was dealing with Black people as a system of racism. And then, of course, Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, talked about mass incarceration and crime and the way that is used to disproportionately and viciously oppress Black communities and Black people. So really all it is telling the truth about Black history, about US history, the fact that Black people are here and we've had an oppressive time from the very beginning. And that even though enslavement is over, new systems of various types of enslavement have emerged. I know you all also heard about Anna Nicole Smith with her Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 and how she talked about, and this goes back to Rosie's question, what if we started American history, just think about it, in 1619 instead of 1776, when the first Africans came here? Let's position it a little different and see how it looks. See how it looks when the first Africans got here. So in many ways, critical race theory is basically talking about and has centered the notion that racism is systemic, it's political, it's historical, it's social. It is not just based on someone's personal belief or bias. And all of these attorneys here had showed how it worked how it works in the legal system, but it works in every system. I mean, we think about COVID-19 right now and what's happening and who are the people most affected by it. There are people who are poor who don't have access to healthcare. Why don't they have access to healthcare? Because they're poor. Who's the most disproportionately poor? The Black Indigenous, and Latinx communities. And if you don't get a mammogram screening, you're going to be more likely, because you're poor, you're going to be more likely to get breast cancer. All of these things have impacted Black lives. And so critical race theory is simply a term that began to talk about this in the legal system, but it opens up the door to think about it structurally in other systems in our society. And this leads me to, I got just 2 more slides here. The prison industrial complex, abolition, and the movement to defund the police. I know this graph is not the best on this kind of slide, but I'd encourage you to look for it. It's all over Google. It was done actually by a former student of mine named Ashley Hunt, who now teaches art in California. But it talks about the way in which the current system is an industrial complex. If you look at this, he starts with the blue, the problems caused by inequality, lack of mental health care, violence, day-to-day insecurity, large amounts of debt, unemployment, exploitation, and overwork, which might mean someone is not home with their child because they're working so many hours. Then their child can get into trouble. Poor education. Our public schools are not funded because public schools in America are largely funded through property taxes. Guess who doesn't have property? Because of housing discrimination and other forms of discrimination, malnutrition, pollution. So he goes through housing here, discrimination. He goes through the situation that sets up the complex. Then he has environmental influences, corporate welfare, big agribusiness, gentrification, big industry and corporations, ideological influences, victim rights groups, right-wing think tanks, political action committees, the media, secondary influences, racist judges, which we just talked about, politicians tough on crime, the war on drugs, rural economic developers, prison industries. I don't know if many of you know, but in many areas, rural areas in America, the only jobs that white people get are in prisons that house us. So they want the prisons. And then prison industries make money. Who gets the cafeteria, the food service contract? Who gets the construction contracts? All of that. Investment banks, they invest in prisons. Prisons are a growth economy. And then the courts. And then in the internal, you have prison officer unions, private prisons for profit, prison construction companies, law enforcement. And so the prison industrial complex is huge, and it comes out of enslavement. And what I'd like to do right now is, I hope this works, is to show a couple of short trailers, one you may have seen, one you may have not, on how these things have worked since the end of enslavement. So the evolution of the prison industrial complex and policing and criminalizing of Black bodies and Black people goes all the way to runaways, which I'm going to talk about next week, and how the very first police in relationship to Black people were in fact slave catchers. And that kind of notion has continued all the way up until today. And the terms abolition and defund the police, these came up, well, it's interesting, again, the term of abolishing the prison system and the prison industrial complex in our country actually is 30 or 40 years old. But like some of these other terms, it is beginning to gain some some familiarity and some usage among a lot of people because the system is broken. People cannot figure out how this system that I just pointed to can be reformed, given our history and the ways in which most people, most Black people who go to prison, they're not violent criminals. They're in prison because of their circumstances and because the over policing in Black communities and Black schools. And so there is a call, and a major term today is the abolition movement. Today is an abolition of the prison industrial complex. And the term defund the police rose with this recent Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives movement. And someone asked me, well, do you really want to get rid of all police? Well, that's a question. The issue is the police obviously don't prevent crime. They respond to crime and put people in jail. But then what is crime? I mean, I remember having a student at my predominantly white institution, and he had come from a public housing project in Ferguson, actually. And he said, you know what, Dr. Brock, when I was growing up, there was so much drugs around, and I was, really trying to stay in school and stay out of trouble. And I got to this institution, and I thought when I got to this institution that actually I wouldn't have to be surrounded by drugs like I was back home. He said there are more drugs on this campus, but the difference is there's no police, so there's no crime. So the whole notion of crime needs to be interrogated. And who is the criminal? Who is the criminal in these situations? So the idea of defunding the police is to raise the question, should 40, 50% of our city budgets, like in Chicago, be used for the police and not for schools? Should it be used for the police and not for our parks? Do we need all of these police? If we had more money in public schools, we wouldn't need policing. So these are the questions that defunding the police take up an extraordinary amount of the resources of most communities. When our schools, our public schools, at least in a lot of major cities and a lot of rural communities, are crumbling. So I can stop there for a question, and then I have one more slide, if there are any, or comments.
We've got a question from Jason Seals. Welcome back. How do we decolonize the minds and hearts of our people without centering whiteness and white supremacy, but center our humanity and the beauty of our ancestry?
That's a lovely question. I think many of us do that all the time, when we have our barbecues, or I really think the notion of Black joy, which I didn't have a slide for, which has really become a term that's also used for Black liberation, is to create situations where we feel whole. And in many ways, we've always done that. I'll never forget remembering when I grew up, both my grandmothers were domestics in rich white households. And I remember seeing TV shows like Beulah and these other shows that painted the Black domestics in one way. And then I looked at my strong Black grandmothers, I was like, it's like night and day, it's like night and day. And so I think who were, wonderful, beautiful human beings in their own milieu. And struggled to be full humans in their workplace as well. But sometimes they could not speak out and speak up in ways that they might have wanted. So I think the key is we need to continue to teach and study our history, our culture, and when I say I'm thinking about a big R. I don't want to be a narrow thinker here, but the fact that we come from places, we have history, we have struggles in which we've won. We need to celebrate those. We've created things that are important, and we continue to create things that are important. And I think centering those kinds of things in our lives are important, and especially teaching our children these things so that they can come out and be full human beings as they enter into this world and as they move forward. So I think we fight white supremacy, but we also do it in a way that doesn't confiscate our souls, you know, that actually doesn't take away our barbecues or our you know, our fried chicken or our vegan soul restaurants in Atlanta that my son goes to all the time. So I think we have to make sure that we create healthy communities and work towards that and try to create healthy sectors within it. And one of the things I think I just wanted to mention before I move on to my next slide is this notion of inside outside organizing, which came up a little bit earlier about choosing leaders. I think we have to be strategic in thinking about how we, in some ways, infiltrate some of the systems and change them from within, which is what I've been doing as a social justice leader, not just for Black students and Black faculty, but for all students and all faculty. There are a lot of white people who just didn't learn anything. I had a student the other day tell me that, you know, without white student, who told me the other day that without the Arcus Center, she probably would have been a white missionary instead of a white activist in solidarity with all kinds of struggles, you know? And so I think we have to work inside the institutions, and that's also political institutions. That's why I support the Squad and some of these folks who are fighting against the more moderate Democratic Party, who are trying to save capitalism in a nice way. And outside, that we push, we agitate, we bring on the street heat, and that we work inside and we work outside. And hopefully in that mix, we can get to something that looks like a better system of democracy for us all. And then we can, you know, we'd have to redefine what democracy looks like, right? We'd have to redefine it.
Dr. Brock, before you move your slide, we have a question that's really good with this slide from Dr. Jacqueline Roden Trader.
Okay.
She says, excellent points, Dr. Brock. What is crime and who is the real criminal? Your student illuminated a major issue in the bias narrative that is spewed in textbooks at institutions of higher learning and mainstream society.
That's right. I'm working on a project on enslavement, and I'm talking about the way in which the Black body was criminalized during enslavement, and the power dynamics. When you think about a policeman willing to shoot a Black man running away, we need to really think about that. What is that saying? Not just about that person, but about that possibility, that the fact that they think they can do that because of power, because of history. Like, don't run away from me. You know, it sounds like enslavement to me. Don't run away from me. So I really think this notion of crime really has to be interrogated in its historical context. And again, when the 13 trailer and the other trailer talked about the monetization, the fact that people are making money still off of our bodies and our labor is really telling. I should tell you something too. Ferguson, I did an article on the Ferguson uprising, and it was discovered that something like 21% of the city budget of Ferguson at that time was based on the fines of Black people for all kinds of stuff. It was in the budget. So Black people had to be fined to run the city budget. And that's exactly what happened with this convict lessee system. So those small towns in Alabama and Mississippi would get paid $500 from the steel industry in Birmingham if they sent them 5 Black men. So the city budgets of those rural communities were also based on the exploitation and the selling of Black people who were jailed for reasons that they should not have been jailed. So yes, this issue of crime is very, very important. And this leads me to my final slide, and that is when we talk the case for reparations. A lot of people may not realize that I first heard about reparations in its modern context. Of course, we heard about the 40 acres and the mule, which was talked about, but not given after the Civil War, which would have been a kind of reparation. But in 1987, the NCOBRA was founded, which was the National, the National Committee, oh shoot. Oh, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America in 1987. And this is attorney Adjua Ayatoro, who's been very active in this movement since that time. And again, when reparations was discussed back then, people were like, oh, never happened. We don't want to talk about it. You know, get over it. And then it came up again in a big way when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his big Atlanta article called The Case for Reparations, which talked not just about reparations for enslavement and the theft of hundreds of years of our labor, but the fact of 90 years of Jim Crow, of which that convict lessee system was a part, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of state-sanctioned redlining, and all the other things that we have suffered in this society. I'll share with you here, my husband and I have just been engaged in a refinance possibility with our house, and we suffered refinance discrimination. And I petitioned and threatened and contested and threatened to sue, and we got it dealt with, but they weren't happy. So this happens, these kinds of things happen all the time. And when I talk about discrimination in refinancing, what I mean is, I don't know if you've read the articles where if an appraiser comes to your house and they see Black art or they see a Black family, the price, the value of your house goes down. And there's been situations where a Black person has asked a white friend to show their house and take down all the art, and the wealth, the value of the house goes up. So this is real, and this just happened 2 weeks ago with me, or 3 weeks ago. So the case for reparations is an interesting point, and smaller communities and universities and cities have been talking about it and have been beginning to do some small things. So maybe, one of the things we could talk about, or people can think about, is what would reparations look like? I think affirmative action, if it had ever been applied, uniformly, was just one tool of reparation. And of course, it got pushed back from racists and the right, and was never fully implemented, although some people still do it. Now we have diversity and inclusion models and belonging models. But again, if people do not think about the structures and the systems that we're up against and that we have to be aware of, then it's only going to go so far. And if you allow me, I just want to end on a video, and then we might have a few minutes for a few more Q&A or things in the chat. Is that okay, coordinators?
Of course.
Okay, thanks, Christine. That's it.
All right, Dr. Brock. Sorry. We don't have any more questions at this time, but thank you for joining us. And I'm going to pass it off to Miss Michelle.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Thank you again for coming this evening. As you can see, you've asked for information about Dr. Brock, as well as about the Howard Social Justice Consortium. Take a picture of the slide. All the information is there. And Dr. Brock, I must tell you that the group is just dying to have your slides, but we've told them that the sessions are being recorded, and that after all the workshops are completed, The sessions with a few minor revisions will be live on Asala TV for your viewing pleasure. So thank you so much for your continued interest. And we hope that all of you will join us again next week on September 29th, when we talk about the history of policing in communities of color and its implications today. And Dr. Brock will be back again. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining in these free social justice workshop Wednesdays. Good night.
Good night, Michelle. Good night, all.